And we are live. All right, hello all. My name is Jefferson Ridgeway. I am a junior in computer science major at Elizabeth City State University in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. BJ, introduce yourself, please.
Hey, my name is BJ Thompson. I serve as the director of Build a Better Us. We are a nonprofit that serves the vitality of marriages. I'm a speaker. I'm a husband of 14 years this year to my wife, Vanja. We have three kids, 12, 8, and 6. And I'm excited to be here with you. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
No problem, man. So what we're gonna get into today is Frederick Douglass and just his life, his impact, and I'm gonna ask BJ some questions. So we're just gonna go ahead and get it popping. So my first question is, who does Frederick Douglass mean to you and why?
Yeah, that's a pretty weighty question, but I would just say overall, what Frederick Douglass means to me, he is, um, man, just a model human who, overcame. We talk about the American story. The American narrative is, work hard to become something, to create something. And I think for me, Frederick Douglass is a picture of what it means to not just fight for your own liberation, because ultimately Frederick Douglass was born into American slavery, but he was a man who fought for the good of others. And so I think that's real humanity. Real humanity isn't fighting for your own space, a two-car garage and a picket fence. True humanity is when you look out for your fellow man, and their pain is your pain. And so for me, Frederick Douglass models a lot of that out, in the way that he cared for others, the way that he fought to create legislation, and the way he was a voice for the voiceless. So yeah, I would say for me, he is definitely a man's man.
All right. Cool. I'm gonna share this link on Facebook so people can join us. Cool, that's a great answer. So my second question is, was Frederick Douglass a revolutionary of his time and why? Like, if he do you consider him a revolutionary of his time during the time that he lived in?
Yeah, Jeff, he was born into slavery.
Right.
When you look at American slavery, one, it was based off of the one's skin. There were theological boundaries, so there was economic boundaries because you were free labor,
Right.
based off of the color of your skin and the fact that you were a descendant of Africa. Two, there were theological boundaries, or barriers where they kept people enslaved because they said they were under the curse of Ham, which was one of Noah's sons.
Mm-hmm.
And three, there were just political boundaries where, it just benefited people to create a social class based off the color of your skin. And you look at all those different things, and you talk about a man like Frederick Douglass. I think that he was a revolutionary because he legitimately fought his way out of an oppressive system. And so, one of the reasons why I see him as more than just kind of a black history figure, but an American figure, is because American, is built on this idea: liberty and justice for all. So, of course, at that time, there was no liberty and justice for people of color. And so, yeah, I would say he is a revolutionary for that reason.
Okay. You got any other more reasons than that, or that was just one of them?
No, no, I was just saying that just the fact that he fought for liberty and justice, and that's what made him a revolutionary in the face of a system that did not offer liberty and justice for people of color. Even that statement was not extended to him, and that's what made him a revolutionary. What makes you a revolutionary is you stand against the normacy of society and culture in a way that creates transformation, in opposition to a large system. So yeah, he was
Right.
definitely a revolutionary. And he wasn't just an African American, he was an American because he helped build the nation.
Right. He helped. He was instrumental in getting black soldiers into the Civil War, if I remember correctly.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay. So here's a good question that I found when I read the narrative of his life, and it was in the appendix. In the appendix, he really talks about Christianity as this religion, and basically how there's this cultural Christianity, and then there's this pure Christianity. How do you think he was able to differentiate between those two during that rough time? I mean, how? I mean, it's easy for us to kind of see that now,
Yeah.
How do you think he was able to during that time to say, okay, obviously these? I mean, how do you think it was? Why do you think it was easy for him, or how do you think it was easy for him?
Yeah. So when you talk about the idea of um, property, people being chattel or property, there's a lot of assumptions being made there, Jeff. We assume that because we assess a person as property, that they lack humanity because we've deprived them of the title of human beings, right?
Hmm.
And all of us live with what's called a conscience, where we feel these things of what's called good and evil warring against us, and we can discern what's good and what's evil. We may not be able to do it maturely without certain truths, but we sense it. We sense when something's wrong, and we sense when something's good. Well, Douglas, even though society had labeled him property, he was a man. He was a human being like all of us, right? And as they began to teach him about this thing called pure religion, pure faith, um, in the Judeo Christian worldview, he recognized that the things that were being talked about um, were not creating change in his reality as he related to the people who were saying that they would change. And so I don't think it takes much, the people who are, in have less influence and less power get to see the real side of you. They get to see the real transformation. And they speak to who you actually are. And so, no, I don't think it took much. I think the society's shocked that he could see the difference because they label people of color as property, but just humankind. You can tell what a society is based off of the perspective of those who had the least amount of power. They can tell you what society is actually about. So no, I'm not surprised that he could distinguish between genuine Christianity or Judeo-Christian worldview versus just kind of this religious sentiment or emotionalism that occurred. And once he saw that, the people who were owned him were still oppressive and abusive, he knew
Right,
that there was something wrong with that worldview.
right. Because I mean, I think about the civil rights era, and of course, we have the prominent fingers of Martin Luther King. On the flip side of Martin Luther King, you have Malcolm X, who is basically preaching against almost everything that the Bible says. Um, so I just found it interesting that he lived in this period where he was able to differentiate the two. Because I think a lot of people now they throw out the whole term of Christianity as a white man's religion,
Yeah.
and they'll use that, and they use that, and the fact that of course slave masters used religion as a tool to harm their slaves in different verses from the scriptures, and taking out of context. So I just thought that was interesting. Like that just really the fact that he was still able to say that he was a Christian at even in that time when you're seeing your faith being demolished by these people.
Absolutely.
I just think that's admirable.
Yeah.
Honestly.
So again, we're only shocked because we believe the assessment of the culture of the time. The assessment of the culture of the time where these weren't people, they were cows, they were property, right?
Right.
These are people. These are actual people. And the only variation is that they have a darker pigment of skin, right? And so, because of that worldview, a lot of people can't assess the intelligence of it. I mean, for a long time, they try to prove that people of color descended from apes in order to justify them not seeing them as people. And so, I think, Jefferson, one thing that we have to recognize is as we go back and look at these narratives, they were dead wrong. They were wrong. These were
Right.
people.
Right.
And the same people that you see today, you and I, were people. Whether a person calls us a cow or not. If I call this a stapler, no matter how much I say you're a stapler, you're a stapler, you're a stapler. No, this isn't a stapler. This is an iPhone, right? And you can try to mold and shape the imagery into convincing it that it's a staple. But regardless of what you say, its core identity is a phone. Okay. And it's the same thing with humankind. It's not that complex because this was an actual human being and he recognized right from wrong. And he knew, you know what, there's something supposed to happen just like we do. There's something that's supposed to happen when you say you believe this mighty God, this mighty creator. And he didn't see that change. And so I would just say we're shocked because we actually believe what society said. And society at that moment was acting as barbarians and capitalists more than they were acting in humane ways towards other people.
Right. Right. So I mean, the follow up question to this is, how do you think he contributed to the to the Christian narrative? Like, how do you think his story and his life contributed to the whole Christian narrative that we know of today? Um, what do you think his impact was, or his impact still is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was a historian first and foremost. You know, one of the most difficult things about creating a certain narrative for culture in an entire nation is that you have to edit a lot. You have to take a lot of the things
Right.
that are shameful, embarrassing, and humiliating, and you have to revise them, right? And the problem with it is you don't get a proper respect for what's occurred to create what exists. One thing that you see from Frederick Douglass, again, and the reason why we need to include him into history, not just into Black history, we need to include him into American history, is he gives us a very intimate view of the institution of owning people. And it was ugly. It was very ugly. I mean, from breeding people like animals, to chopping off body parts, to being very abusive, to creating post traumatic stress among people. He gives you a very intimate view of that. And so I think one of the contributions that we gain is a historical narrative. The
Right.
second thing I think we gain, even from a faith perspective, is that even in the face of evil, we shouldn't be silent, right? Oftentimes, Jeff, we like to commend people once they've done a good deed, and once they pass, and once that they've overcome something. But as he was overcoming what he was overcoming, he was actually doing something that was illegal at the time, right?
Right.
We learn that true revolutionaries have to have courage in order to engage um, the inhumane systems of the time, which could also be legal, right? So, one of the contributions that we see is sometimes you have to oppose inhumane systems that have been legalized. And again, that's what you see with Frederick Douglass is he contributes in that way where we go, you know what? There's a such thing as legal, inhumane systems that you and I may have to oppose, and they may either cost us our freedom or they may cost us our life. The third thing I would say from a Judeo Christian worldview, I think what he shows us is that our role isn't to just focus on ourselves as individuals, but our roles is to participate in the systemic change of human life, right? Douglas could have been free, moved to Canada, and kept it moving, just lived his life, right? But he
Right.
recognized that his role was also wrapped up in the liberation of those who were still oppressed. And that's huge. That's what Judeo-Christian worldview teaches, is that it's not about your personal relationship with the higher power. It's about your personal relationship in a way that it carries you to care for other people. So,
Right. Right. Yeah. So, next to last question. I think I got a few more. I'm sorry.
come on.
Uh, what is the impact? What do you think the impact of Frederick Douglass is in 2016 in this current time? We have hashtag Black Lives Matter.
Mhm.
We have this political season that is very um interesting. I'll say,
Yes, to say the least. Yeah.
to say the least, very interesting. You got it. Um, it's just a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of it. I think is racial. It's coming down to people and them dealing with racism or being on the other end of racism.
Hmm.
And me and my mother, we just saw Zootopia last weekend. Great movie.
Okay.
Great movie.
Yeah.
But it talks about just this society where you have these marginalized people who are stereotyped. So it's like, how do you think Frederick Douglass's impact is in 2016? Like, what do you think it is among all these issues that are going on in this country?
Yeah.
Um, what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think his impact is that in the face of any form of system that oppress any type of human being, they're men's men who stand up and say that's not okay. Um, and I think, what we can do is if we can learn from the past so that we don't end up repeating it. When you look at a lot of our kind of current views on the past, we look at the past as outdated, unhelpful, and unuseful. When in reality is, we are a byproduct of what's occurred in the past. And so, if you're talking about the specific kind of uprisings or resistance to, the militarization of police, um, the looking at legislation that has throughout years, hundreds of years, been targeted and bent to prosecute at a higher rate people of color. If you're looking at all those different things, I think what we can learn from Frederick Douglass is that even though he understood liberation, he understood systems to liberate people, right? He couldn't just run out, grab who he wanted to grab, and create what he wanted to create. He had to take what he had within the confines of the systems, and he had to work through structures at times. And so one thing I think we can learn is if you're going to create real liberation, sometimes you got to work through the systems. Now, I'm not saying there's not times where you can't organically resist evil or resist that which oppresses, but you see Frederick Douglass doing both. He both left out of his situation and later came back and was like, hey, this is paid for, this is done. But then he also worked through legislation. So I think it's both. I think you see both grassroots and organized ways to liberate people.
Okay. Because I was about to say, again, reading his narrative, that he talks about how he commended Harriet Tubman and her success with the Underground Railroad, but he
Mm-hmm.
didn't necessarily condone it.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like, I mean, I don't think he threw a shot towards her, but he was kind
Yeah.
of saying like that's a way of doing things, but I'm not gonna go that route.
Yeah.
You know, so it's kind of, I see what you're saying with that. Yeah, grassroots and organic.
Yep.
Um, my next question is, why do you think Frederick Douglass is not taught in schools, in seminaries, in churches? Because I mean, growing up, I knew of MLK like after what, second, third grade. I knew of
Yeah.
who he was, and then later on, I had to search around and I figured out who Malcolm X was because I didn't find it out in school like that. I had to search it out for myself.
Yeah.
But why do you think Frederick Douglass is not being taught as a figure of history,
Yeah.
and of even in the African American community, why he's not even taught even then? Because I mean, when you think about our history, it's like the person that comes up in my mind, our mind is again MLK.
Yeah.
It's either MLK or Malcolm X, and those are the only
Yeah.
two people. We
Yeah.
know there's been a lot of other people that have before them and after them. But I know everybody can't make a movie. We can't make a movie about every black person, but at
Absolutely.
the same time, how can the information be passed down to the generations of their importance in that time period, and why it translates to us today?
Absolutely. So I mean, the reason why I believe Frederick Douglass isn't taught accurately is because what Frederick Douglass stands for, he disrupts the narrative of certain social classes. I mean, when you think about it, the fact that he was a well-educated freed slave does not coincide with the narrative that we've been handed. That one day the Civil War happened, people just showed up, and then civil rights all of a sudden occurred. I think it breaks from the norm of society. And unfortunately, to our detriment, we have created a society based off of social classes, and some of those social classes are based off the color of one's skin. And so I think one of the reasons why he's not taught, just quite frankly, is because his life disrupts that narrative. We like the nice kind of cool couched, deal. George Washington did this. Here's what happened in the American Revolution. Here's what occurred in the Great Depression, and we like kind of this clean cut narrative. But when you start talking about freed people responding to injustice and highlighting them as heroes, it gives a little bit more dignity than what our society has done to people of color, especially in America. And it creates questioning. So for us, he's just a staple. I don't even know why we know of Frederick Douglass historically. We've heard his name, we know vaguely what he's about, but I think it's disruptive to the narrative. But as a society, we miss out on the beauty of saying, you know what? All people deserve dignity. All people deserve honor. That wasn't okay. We need to mourn the injustice that occurred there, and not just in America, but across the globe. When you give me any major, any continent in the country, then there's been large forms of injustice done in order to justify capitalism and imperialism. And so yeah, again, I think that we can have those type of people included within the narrative, but it's only because we want to see the good of humanity flourish, not a particular political system or ethnic group flourish.
Right. All right. um, my next question is now: how can people of color, African Americans, and not just African Americans, but minorities in general, how can we correctly emulate Frederick Douglass in the current time? Like, how can we, with our character, with how we carry ourselves, social activism, whatever it may be, how can we correctly emulate him? How do you think we should do that, or should we? I mean, that's a question too.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one, Frederick Douglass had the line about once he recognized that he was a man, that no one could deny him that. I think one thing that our society does, they like to degrade people of color to either criminals, lazy, unintelligent. It's really strange, but again, I get it. It's an ongoing narrative that's occurred for hundreds of years. So the first thing I will say is you have worth and you have dignity and you have nothing to prove to anyone, right? So that's the first thing I would say. And I think society needs to hear that. Society needs to hear that people of color don't need to prove that they're worth being valued, that they already have a value. And you learned it from Frederick Douglass. Second thing is this: when you see degradation of humanity or human beings being degraded, it's okay to speak up, right? It's okay to
Mm-hmm.
speak up. And I think that we have, we've been called race baiters, all kind of other stuff. When you notice that humanity is being degraded, it's okay to speak up. And that's actually the manly thing to do. That's actually the human thing to do. And so we do that with the unborn. We do that with the poor. We do that with those who have special needs. We can do that for people of color, right? The third thing is this: read. Read. Don't be subject to the lies that we all circulate around. Read. Understand historical narratives. See that, man, you come from an amazing group of people, and that as a counterpart, you can be interdependent in society, instead of feeling as if you're just dependent on society. Because again, there's a narrative that's occurring, and it's a very old narrative that there's a certain space for you. You need to fit in this particular box. And what we see from Frederick Douglass, he was a statesman. I mean, how do you go from being a person who's chattel to being a statesman? And it's because you believe something about yourself, but you recognize that there's tons of obstacles just for you to get there. So read, know your worth, and never feel like you have to prove anything to anyone, because you don't. You already fit into society. It's just that they're catching up with the idea of the equality that already exists there.
All right. Well, on that note, that leads right to my next question.
Come on.
What books would you suggest on Frederick Douglass, or just in general? I know on your Twitter you're circulating the book Divided by Faith.
Yep.
You keep suggesting that book. Do you have any
Yep.
other books on Frederick Douglass or any otherwise that will help with this subject matter for
Yeah.
people who can look at?
Yeah, so I mean that's a great question. So one thing that I think we have to do, we have to read cross culturally.
All right.
We can't just read, our particular narrative. It harms us to assume this form of elitism that the smartest people are white. It actually hurts us. It hurts us as a society, and it keeps us from being able to value different types of lives and perspectives. The other thing that I would say is this: there's a book that I recommend, Divided by Faith, because it helps us see that we're not just individuals, that we are collective. And the things that keep us from seeing ourselves as a large society is we've really bought into this: I'm an independent person. You are an independent person, but you're part of a larger system, right? The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass is spot on. I think it's a great historical piece, but it's inspiring. And you still see the ongoing wrestle. The other thing that I'll recommend, there's a book by W.E.B. Du Bois called The Soul of Black Folk, and it outlines this idea of what it is, what does it mean to look through the lens of people who've been oppressed, dealing in a changing climate, and how did they get there? What was it that occurred for it to be created? Oftentimes, Jeff, we look at situations and we look at the symptoms, and we don't look at the root. We don't even know where it came from and how it occurred. But history gives us the opportunity to go, oh wow, this is why things are the way they are. So that's what I would say. The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, Divided by Faith by Emerson, and then the book The Soul of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois.
All right, I'll definitely be adding that to my library. So I guess this is the last question, and after
Okay.
that, you can say anything else you want to add. Uh, what can, how can I say this? What can, what can churches do to walk out what Frederick Douglass started? Like, what can we do? Like, what as Christians and people who follow Christ, we
Yeah.
believe in the risen Savior, all
Yeah.
that good stuff. The question I always find myself at is, I believe in Jesus. How do I live now? I always
Yeah.
find myself at that point. How do I live? Like, how should I live?
Yeah.
And of course, the unifying answer is love, but I think it's a little bit more. It's love, and that is the answer, but I think it's a little more complex than that.
Absolutely.
Um, so what would you say to that? And you don't. This is not really tying to Frederick Douglass anymore, but that's just what do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, we just finished up a session. I think when you see people, you need to see yourself. Too often it's us versus them. It's not just us, right? And I think that's huge. Is I need to change my lens from the us versus them to it's us, right? Two, you have to learn history. One thing is we do ourselves a disservice by trying to apply answers to problems and we don't know where they came from, right? And so one thing that people of faith can do is actually learn for themselves history. And it depends on where you are in the world. You may be in Asia, you may be in Russia, you may be in Australia, you may be in certain parts of Northern Africa, Southern Africa, the Ivory Coast. You may be in Europe somewhere. Learn the history so that when you make the application, it's consistent with the systemic roots, not just consistent with what you're assessing on the surface, right? And the third thing I would say is, man, fight to build relationships that are not like you. One of the powerful things for me is having friendships that don't reflect my ethnicity, don't necessarily share my upbringing, don't share some of my interests, and don't share some of my experiences. That's really helpful for me because now it helps me think outside of myself to care for people unlike me, but still love them in a way that reflects me.
Right. Right. Hey man, that's all I got for you.
Appreciate it, brother.
Do you have anything else you want to say to the people about Frederick Douglass, or what's on your heart, or even your website, or what you have anything else to say?
Yeah, I mean, you can check me out, BJ at 116 BJ, on Twitter. And yeah, check us out. Build a Better Us, man. We want to build healthy families and speaker and serve in that capacity. But one thing I would say is I think we need to start fighting to have a lens that doesn't see people as something very opposite from us. They're people. They're people just like your people. And we got to fight that because we have created a system over couple of hundred years that says people are property, right? And so even as we talk about Frederick Douglass, my reluctancy is to talk about Frederick Douglass as a Black history hero because, quite honestly, Frederick Douglass is just a hero, period, and he should have been included within the American scope of historical narrative. So we got to begin to fight to undo some of the stuff that's been done through a couple of hundreds of years. So
Right. So do you, I mean, okay, I think I'm good. I think I got all the questions.
okay,
Okay. Yeah, man. Well, yeah, that's it. I think that's like I said. I think that's all the questions.
appreciate
Thank you
it.
again for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay,
All right.
peace.
Peace.